time was always 8 p.m. and they were like, "Can you do it at 8 p.m.?"
Oh,
Like, I guess so.
Amazing.
Yeah.
well, there's
We
Lynn.
are now live, just so you know.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so we may have people streaming from our Facebook page, if that's okay.
Okay. Let's
So
see. Yeah.
we'll see who joins us.
This is good. Rachel, thank you for the wonderful presentation and the mailing that you sent out.
Yeah, of
I
course.
was flattered and
Well, I'm going to
Great.
introduce you officially when we're ready to begin too.
can for
Give you
sure.
The whole spiel.
For sure.
I realized when I wrote the article and I realized we've been friends for over 20 years. I was like, oh God, how did that happen?
Yeah. That's right. How old is Jordan these days?
He's going to turn 16 this summer,
16. Wow.
which all being well, he would have been with you in Israel, but not anymore.
Yeah.
Not
Well,
with
next, there's always next year.
Alavai.
I hope. Yeah.
We'll give it another minute or two.
Oh, Rabbi
Our
Gutterman
Rabbi
is joining
Emeritus
us.
will be joining us.
Nice.
It's exciting. Is Amy sleeping?
Probably, yeah. And the kids have been sleeping for a couple hours. So yeah,
How old are your kids, Gadi?
the house is quiet. My daughter is 12 going on 16
Yeah.
and my son is 10.
Nice. I have a
So
16-year-old daughter.
she's a teenager and he's still a kid.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Les
Heads
Gutterman. How are you,
Hi,
dear?
Les.
Shalom, Les.
Hey, I just want you to know I have to pick my wife up from her chemo infusion at 4:30, so I'll log off. But it's nice to see your face and send
Thank
my
you.
love to your in-laws and your wife.
Will do. Thank you.
Okay.
Refuah shlema.
Yeah. Love to Janet, Les. There's Elaine. Good.
Online, I will.
Cool background, Elaine. I like that. So it's kind of cool, all the graduations that are going on.
Yeah,
for all
virtual
the,
one.
virtual ones, and I've seen some pretty cool ones. One, I think it was University of Michigan, had a little robot with an iPad attached to it. And literally the robot would come up to the dean with the face of the person. That's,
Oh,
so
that's
they've
crazy.
done all kinds of interesting stuff.
Go blue.
Mazel tov to Liam. Mazel tov to Liam from
Oh, yeah.
HBS. Yay.
Thank you. I know it's hard to believe we're done with elementary school.
That's exciting, Sarah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Goes so quickly.
All right, friends. Well, it's 4 o'clock, so I honor the people who are on time. Thanks. The blessing of technology in these times of pandemic is that we get to engage friends from all around the world. And so I'm thrilled to introduce you all to my dear friend Gadi Ben-Dov. Gadi was born here in the United States, but raised on a kibbutz in the Galilee, and he now lives outside Jerusalem in Modi'in, correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Gadi became a licensed tour guide after finishing his service in the IDF as an officer, and he traveled the world. He loves Israel and especially the people of Israel, and have given him insights into his country, and he shares with every visitor. And I personally experienced that. We've known each other for well over 20 years, having worked together for NIFTY in Israel, both in Jerusalem and all over Israel and in the New York office. And even were roommates for 6 months before he went back home to Israel. So I can honestly say you're in for a treat, and I'm just thrilled to have him here. So Gadi, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll give you the floor.
Dalaba. Thank you very much. Shalom, y'all, as we say in the South. I'm going to try and share my screen so that we can start our presentation. And let's see if the technology will allow me to do that. Here we go. Okay. Judy, are we okay? Give me a thumbs up. You can see my screen and all that. Yes, excellent. That's right. I have to say which Judy, right? There are a lot of
Right.
all right. So it's funny because I, as Rachel said, I've known her and her husband Craig for, wow, 20 years or more. It's hard to believe. And I crashed at their place for what went from a week to 3 weeks to 6 months in the end. So thank you again for sharing that experience and time with you guys. And when I sent her a list of the things, the presentations that I was doing, this was one of the things that caught her eye, I think. And the superheroes, or the Jewish Justice League, is sort of something that I kind of made up. But I think it's an interesting topic, because when I travel around Israel and I present certain places and I talk about different rabbis and different people, I like to use references that people around me understand, and especially for teens and kids and families, I like to mention, and oh yeah, Rabbi Akiva, he's up there in the Justice League of the Jewish superheroes. So we'll talk a little bit about what I consider to be a Jewish superhero, and we'll go from there. Hopefully you'll enjoy the presentation, and at the end, I'm happy to stay on for any questions. Let's just all make sure that we're muted, and if one of our hosts can mute everyone, that would be great. And at the end, as I said, I'm happy to answer questions. So what do I consider a superhero? And I'm sure all of you have a different answer to this question. And even more so, what is a Jewish superhero, if at all something like that exists? I don't know if you guys know this, but most of these characters that you see on the right-hand corner on the bottom have been invented by Jews. Superman, Batman, and all of those guys. It's interesting, I've read some articles that maybe suggest that because we were always oppressed and we were always small and the weaker side, we sort of dreamt about having supernatural powers and those saviors that would come in and save us. And of course, in Israel, we've had someone called Sabra Man. I bet you haven't heard about this guy, created by an Israeli called Uli Fink. I remember these comic books. There's probably like 40 of them. He's not around anymore, but it was something that was created in Israel too. And of course, Sabra Man helps the people of Israel and state of Israel and all of that. But that's really not, we're not going to talk about comic characters. What I'd like to talk about are, throughout our history, who are the people that have helped us shape the idea of Judaism, shape the ideas of who we are, how we live our life, and according to what have we lived our lives as Jews. So here's an interesting start, and let's see how it works. So first of all, the first version of how to be Jewish, we received probably around 1200 BCE. I use the term BCE, before the Common Era, and then Common Era. BC and AD are Christian terms, and we try to use a more general term. So the first superhero really that gave us the ideas of how to be Jewish is this guy. I'm sure you've heard of him. His name is Moses, and Moses brought us the Torah. Now, if you're a fan of Mel Brooks, you probably know that he walked down Mount Sinai with 3 tablets and actually drops one. Never mind. But the bottom line is, he doesn't come down with just the 10 Commandments, which is what a lot of people usually say. He comes down with a whole Torah. And then he transfers the Torah to the elders, and the elders tell it to the people. So in the beginning, we had the Torah. Now, the Torah has 613 mitzvot and many more laws than that. And when you think about when the Torah was written, remember it was somewhere 1200, 3200 years ago, 1200 BCE. We have a lot of, first of all, it's written in Hebrew, which a lot of us can't really read nowadays. And even those of us who read Hebrew, myself included, it's not always a very clear statement in the Torah. And to demonstrate that, I want to show you an example of a law that is in the Torah. It's called the law of the blue shirts. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 10. No, I'm just kidding. It's not. But here's just to make my point. On Tuesdays, which is today, you should wear a blue shirt. Okay, so this is the law. Now, what does that mean? What is blue? Is this blue? Or maybe this? Or maybe this? Or no, I think this is definitely blue. Or maybe this shade of blue. Or so what is blue? Now, that's not all. What is, here's all the spectrum of the colors of blue and different shades of blue, and different people can call different shades of blue blue. This is in the Israel Museum, a very cool, one of my most famous Jewish superheroes from the Israel Museum. His name is Roy G. Biv, not Jewish, never mind. But now that we know what blue is, we have another issue to deal with. What's a shirt? Is this a shirt? Is this a shirt? I prefer this one, actually. Some people would prefer this as a shirt. And yet others might say that this is a sweatshirt. Actually, some people call it a jumper. And maybe this is a shirt. So bottom line is we have different versions of shirts. Maybe even this is a shirt. It does cover parts of our body, but different interpretations. We're not done yet because we don't know exactly what blue is. We don't know exactly what a shirt is. And what about Tuesday? Does Tuesday start at midnight? Does it start at sunrise? Does it start when I wake up? So we have all kinds of different interpretations of a simple sentence of wearing a blue shirt on Tuesday. So this is obviously a satirical and sort of a funny example. Let's take a real example, which is this, one of the basic laws in Judaism, that you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. This is a funny picture that Amy and I found, but it's a basic rule. It appears in 3 different places in the Torah, and people have understood this in very different ways. Because does it mean that you can't have beef with goat milk? Does it mean you can't have cow milk with goats? Or even a better interpretation is a situation that happened in Eastern Europe in the 15, 16, 1700s, when beef was very rare. And in order to continue to remember that we need to separate milk and meat, the rabbis decided that chicken is considered meat, and therefore you can't have chicken parmesan because you're mixing chicken and milk. But this sentence clearly doesn't say anything about a chicken. So laws of the Torah, and obviously nowadays with cheeseburgers, some people would say, what does that rule in Deuteronomy have anything to do with a juicy cheeseburger at Jackson Hole or anything like that? So we have different ways of understanding the laws of Judaism. And throughout our history, we've had different people, superheroes, that have helped us understand and change the way we interpret and live by these rules. So we talked about the Torah at Sinai, and one of the first people that really changed the way we live in Judaism is a woman named Ruth, very connected to the holiday that's coming up on Thursday evening. Ruth was a Moabite. She was not from the Jewish people. And yet, the story of Ruth is brought in the Jewish Bible, and it's brought as an example of how you should treat people who are not from our clan, that marry into our family. And it's not only is her story mentioned as a positive story. I don't know if all of you know this, but Ruth actually marries a nice Jewish boy by the name of Boaz. And Ruth and Boaz have a son named Ovad, and Ovad has a son named Jesse, and Jesse has a son named David, who became the king of Israel. So not only is the story presented in a way that now changes the way we understand people who are outside of our clan that have joined in, she's also the great grandmother of King David, who's a major player in our story. So Ruth is one example, still in the Bible, but let's continue in our timeline. And around 1000 BCE, King David becomes the king of Israel, and his son Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, the first temple. And then in 586 BCE, the Babylonians come in and they destroy the temple and they exile our people to Babylon. And we write some Baptist songs there, on the rivers of Babylon. And we come back and we are led by two guys named Ezra and Nehemiah. And Ezra and Nehemiah realize that the Jewish people don't know their Torah. So they institute a tradition that every Monday and Thursday on market days and on Shabbat, the Torah is divided into 52 portions. And each week on Monday, Thursday, and Shabbat, that Torah portion is read. And in many ways, they change the way we understand our Torah because we're now starting to read those Torah portions again. It's still not translated. Okay, and at that point, we have this guy over here, or two guys by the name of Hillel and Shammai. We'll talk about them very soon. And in 332, when the Greeks come in, Alexander the Great, he has a big grape on his head, just kidding. Alexander the Great conquers the world, and eventually the Hasmoneans, or as most of us know them as the Maccabees, rebel against the Greeks and are independent for about 100 years. Two rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, have some interesting discussions about how to understand the Torah. And what they do, Rabbi Hillel does, is he starts to create rules that if you can see a sentence that talks about a specific issue, how do you infer from that about the rest of life? All kinds of issues are presented in later books about arguments between Hillel and Shammai. Hillel wins most of the arguments. Most of what we do today are based on Hillel. If you've gone to college and university, the Hillel houses on all of the campuses are named after Hillel HaZaken, Rabbi Hillel. And a great example about this is the Hanukkah candles. And what you can see here, you have Hillel over here and Shammai, and they had an argument about how do you light the Hanukkah candles? Do you light them one on the first night and then sort of a build up to the last night, which is what Hillel was suggesting, to create sort of a build up in anticipation. Whereas Shammai was saying, no, let's start with a bang and light all of the 8 candles and then diminish the candles as the holiday goes on. So you obviously know, most of you understand and know that Hillel won the argument because that's who we follow nowadays. So Hillel HaZaken, as he's known later on in a book called the Mishnah, I'm already giving away the next part, he really starts to organize the rules of the Torah in a way that we think about them logically. And a lot of what he wrote and what he said continues on into the Roman period when the Romans come in. And then we have a very important guy that's important for our brothers and sisters of the Christian world, which most of you live around the Christian world. And by the way, I wouldn't say most, but a lot of Christians, especially the evangelical ones, are starting to look back at this time period and something called Pirkei Avot, which talks a lot about Hillel and Shammai and some other Rabban Gamliel and some other rabbis, and starting to understand that they can teach them more about the time of Jesus. But moving forward, the Romans appoint a guy named Herod, really crazy. We won't get into that too much. He builds a very fancy temple, a new version of the Second Temple, which in 66 CE or AD, the Romans destroy. And the Romans basically don't allow the Jews back into Jerusalem. And then 70 years later, there's another guy named Rabbi Akiba, who's definitely one of my superheroes, who leads a rebellion of the Jews against the Romans. And he chooses a general, a warrior, because he's a rabbi, he's not a fighter. And the name of the general is a guy named Shimon Bar Koziva. Now, Koziva comes from the word disappointment, not a good name for a general leading a rebellion. So Rabbi Akiva says to him, I hereby dub you son of the stars. And he changes his name to Shimon Bar Kochva. And that means Simon, son of the stars, much better name for a rebellion, for a leader of a rebellion. And the reason for this rebellion that Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kochva were leading was because the Romans said to the Jews, you cannot learn Judaism anymore. You can't practice your Judaism. And what Rabbi Akiva does at this point is understanding that people can't read the Torah anymore. I actually forgot to mention before that during the time of the Greeks, around 300 BCE or so, the written version of the Bible came up. Up until then, it was basically passed from generation to generation, from parents to children, and only around 300 BCE, it was written down. So Rabbi Akiva, understanding that we can't read and teach anymore, he started to think about Jewish law in a way that would be organized in different topics. So he organizes 6 different topics that are better known later on as the Mishnah. And the Mishnah, I brought here the 6 different topics, is organized and written down and codified together around 200 CE by another superhero, a guy by the name of Rabbi Judah the President, who was the leader of the largest Jewish community in the Galilee in a city called Tzipori, Sepphoris, amazing city with beautiful mosaics. Next time you come to Israel, we'll definitely go there and see the city. And the Mishnah is organized in these 6 different topics. So for example, you have Zra'im, which is about agriculture and work, and you have the Moed, which is about the festivals, and Kodashim, which is about how to basically do things when you're being Jewish and going to synagogue and prayer and so on. One of the interesting things that Rabbi Akiva and the Mishnah deals with is the fact that there isn't a temple anymore, because some of the 613 mitzvahs that were required to do pertain to the fact that we have a temple in Jerusalem. But after the temple is destroyed, there's no more ability for us to do that. And therefore, we have to change the way we think about Judaism. So Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, codifying the Mishnah. So moving on, and now in the 3rd century, 300s or so, the Jews who were not allowed by the Romans to be in the area of Judea or the area of Jerusalem are now pushed even further because the Byzantine Empire starts, the Roman Empire becomes Christian, and a large number of Jews moves out of the land of Israel and goes to Babylon. Where is Babylon of today? Where is it today? Anybody know? It's Iraq, between the rivers of the Euphrates and the Tigris. And the largest Jewish community is really in Babylon. And it's sort of butting heads all the time with the other large Jewish community, which is in the Galilee, in the northern part of Israel. And these 2 large Jewish communities, by the way, interesting idea about what's happening today in the Jewish world. These 2 communities produce a book called the Talmud. And there are really 2 versions of the Talmud. There's the Babylonian Talmud that comes out a little bit later, around the 500s or so, and the Jerusalem Talmud, which comes out around the 400s or so. Now, if you were listening, and I'm sure you're all listening, you're probably asking yourself, wait a minute, didn't Gadi just say that we're not allowed to be in Jerusalem? We're not allowed to be in the area of Jerusalem. So you're right, they called it the Jerusalem Talmud because they wanted it to sound or to connect to Jerusalem, but it was really put together, anybody know? In Tveria, Tiberias, which was the center of Jewish Galilee in the 400s, 500s. So we have 2 versions of the Talmud, which is the new decisive way of how to be Jewish. Lots of different rabbis are mentioned in here and putting things together. And what is the Talmud? Let's understand that for a minute. So the Talmud is really pieces of the Mishnah over here. Remember the earlier version of how to be Jewish. And then the Gemara, or Gomorrah, as you guys call it in America. And this is interpretations of later rabbis of this. And then you have a guy named Rashi over here, and this is Rambam, Maimonides, and this is rabbis from the Middle Ages, and this is rabbis from the 17th century, and this is rabbis from the 20th century. In other words, it's layers upon layers of Jewish law, of how to be Jewish. So to understand that, I've made different colors here, okay? So the pink is the original Mishnah, which really talks about the original, which is the Torah. And then you have the Gemara over here, which is, let's say 700, 800 or so. And then you have a guy named Rashi, who's from the 10th century, and a guy named Maimonides or Rambam, who's from the 12th century. And then you have more rabbis, and eventually you have layers upon layers of Jewish law. So when you think about how to be Jewish, nowadays people go to this book of the Talmud. Now remember, the Mishnah had 6 volumes. The Talmud has 14 volumes. And we're going to continue and talk about what happens to Jews in this time period. So the Romans exiled the Jews, essentially. We always learn about how after the destruction of the temple, Jews go all around the world. So they go to the Muslim world over here. It's not on our map, and to Baghdad or Babylonia, Iraq of today, with the creation of Islam around 650 CE. Around the 700s or so, the Muslims take over the entire area of North Africa, which Jews immigrate to as well. And eventually in the 800s end up in Spain, in what we call the Golden Age of Spain. And even then, from the areas of the Roman Empire, you have Jews going into Hungary, Austria, Germany. All this, remember, is the Roman Empire. And eventually you can see the dates here. We end up in Poland as well, more about that soon, and even as far as England or the British Islands. So Jews spread all around the world, and each one of these Jewish communities needs sort of an understanding of how to be Jewish. So who are the people that help them? Who are the superheroes that help in that matter? So we had the Talmud around the 400, 500 or so. And then in the 10th and 11th centuries, or 11th and 12th, it should be really, we have 2 major players by the name of Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, and the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. And here we are. So Rashi, around 1050 or so, he lives in France and later on in Germany. And remember, 1050 is the beginning of the creation of the Crusades. And Jews are not having a good time in Europe at that time. The Crusaders, as they're leaving for the Holy Land, a lot of issues are going on here. A lot of statements are made, a lot of bans on what Jews are allowed and not allowed to do. And what Rashi does is he takes the rules of the Torah and the rules of the Talmud, essentially, and he interprets them for the layperson. He writes it in amazingly clear sentences and clear ways. And he's a very prolific writer. In his entire life, he translates, for lack of a better way, the rules of the Torah. And he also does most of the Talmud. He was able to do 10 volumes out of the 14 volumes of the Talmud. And his followers eventually finished up his students, the last 4 volumes. And basically what we have here, and I remember as a kid studying Torah in 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, that the teacher referred us to Rashi because it's written in very simple ways. So very major superhero of helping us understand in layman's terms what the law is talking about. What does it mean to wear a blue shirt on Tuesday? And what is blue? When does it start? And so on. The Rambam, or Maimonides, as you guys know him in America, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, he lives, born in Cordoba of southern Spain. later on moves to Fez in Morocco, eventually Cairo, and even makes it all the way to the Holy Land, to the land of Israel. And he's buried, anybody know where is he buried? In Tiberias, in the city of Tveria. And Rambam does a very interesting thing. He writes a book, which is essentially the next book of how to be Jewish. It's called the Mishnah Torah. Notice that he takes the two words of the Torah and the Mishnah and puts them together, and basically clarifies and writes the rules of the Torah. He builds on what Rashi was doing about 100 years before him. And Rambam also adds a very interesting element, because he is living under the Muslim rule. Remember that back then in the 11th, 12th century, Europe is backwards. The Muslim world is very prosperous. Scientists and doctors and lawyers and all kinds of philosophers and different things that are happening in the Muslim world. And Rambam is a doctor, a lawyer, Jewish mother's dream. He's not a dentist, as far as I know, but he definitely uses and understands and interprets in his writings a lot of Greek philosophy, things that were never even considered in the attempt to understand what the Torah is teaching us. So he, in a way, brings in the modern world of the time, of course, to understand what the laws of Judaism are telling us. So these two superheroes, 10th, 11th century and 12th century, Rashi 1050 or so, and Rambam 1100s. And moving on, we're now in the 15th century or so. And here, as you all know, what happens in 1492? Anybody? Columbus sails the ocean blue. I love Americans. Other stuff happens in 1492 that's important to us, to the Jewish people. And that is that there's an expulsion of the Jews from Spain. By the way, there were earlier expulsions, including 1290 from the United Kingdom or from the British Islands. But in 1492, the Jews split. The center of Judaism, which was centered in Spain, that was rivaling or fighting essentially with the Jewish understanding that was happening in the Muslim world in Baghdad or in Babylon. Now we have a different split. We have some Jews that go north to the European Christian world, and they end up in an area called Ashkenaz, and we know them today as Ashkenazi Jews. Most of these Jews go towards France, Germany, and eventually the center of Jewish thought at that point in the early 1500s becomes, believe it or not, Krakow in Poland. And we'll talk about the people who are important in that part. And that here we have the progression that we talked about up until now. And in the 15th century or 16th century, really, 1500s, we have two major rabbis, Joseph Caro and Rabbi Moshe Isserles, or the Ramah. So we talked about the Ashkenazi Jews. Some Jews go south, back to the Muslim world, where things were good, and they go to North Africa and even as far as Turkey, Greece, Hungary, where the Ottoman Empire is now in control. The Ottomans wanted the Jews to come in. They knew the Jews are literate. They knew the Jews are very good at trade and math. And some Jews even go all the way to the Holy Land, and they settle in a city called, anybody? Tzfat, the city of Tzfat in the mountains of the Galilee. And a very important guy settles over there, and that's this guy over here, Rabbi Joseph Caro. And Rabbi Joseph Caro understands that the world as we know it is gone, because Spain and the center of Judaism is no more. There's now a center that's evolving in Krakow or Poland, or Galicia as it was called at that point in time, Poland of today. And there's a need for a new version of how to be Jewish. And he writes something called the Shulchan Aruch, or the set table, the table that's ready for us. More about that in a moment. At the same time that Rabbi Joseph Caro understands that there's a need for a new version of Judaism, this guy by the name of Rabbi Moshe Isserles, or the Ramah, who's the head rabbi of Krakow, where tens of thousands of Jews in the early 1500s are coming to join his community, he realizes as well that we need a new version of Judaism. And both of these guys are writing a book, a new guidebook on how to be Jewish. And Rabbi Moshe Isserles is pretty much ready to go to print. And then he gets a special delivery from Amazon, a book that just came off the print, and it's known as the Set Table. And he looks at it and he's terrified because it's exactly what he was doing. And he's just about to throw his manuscript into the fire, and his wife stops him. Of course, it's always the wife that thinks sensibly about these things. And his wife stops him and says, just a minute, let's read and see what happens. And they both realize that Rabbi Joseph Caro wrote a Shulchan Aruch, or a set table with food and ready to eat. He basically sees Judaism as a buffet that you can sort of understand. If you like this food, you'll take the volume about that. If you like something else, you'll take the volume about that. And remember, the Mishnah had 6 volumes, the Talmud had 14, the Shulchan Aruch already has 17 volumes. And what Rabbi Moshe Isserles, the Ramah in Poland, in Krakow, understands is that Joseph Caro is writing for Sephardi Jews. He's writing for Ashkenazi Jews, and that what he wrote can complement the Shulchan Aruch. So basically, when you pick up a volume of the Shulchan Aruch, which is basically the most up-to-date volumes of how to be Jewish, written, as I said, in the early 1500s, you have both of these versions sort of combined together, and you'll have the Sephardi version for anyone who follows the Sephardi tradition, and the Ashkenazi tradition of the tablecloth or the mapah. So they're actually combined together. So these two superheroes have really made a difference in the way we understand Judaism today. All right, so moving forward. So I've looked around a little bit, and there really isn't a Superman or a Batman or anything like that in Judaism. We sort of trust in God and our prophets and our rabbis, but there is one story where there's a sort of a superhero, and this is in the mid-1500s. This rabbi over here, Rabbi Lau, Aryeh Lau, who lives in Prague, and there are pogroms, there are attacks on Jews, and he comes up with an interesting concept. He takes some mud or some soot from the riverbed in Prague, and he blows mefiach neshama is the word in Hebrew, which is a very cool word because it's the same word as breath. So he gives breath into this, he calls it a golem, which literally means a thing. It's sort of a Jewish version of Frankenstein. And if you look closely, you'll see that the words emet. What does emet mean in Hebrew? Truth. Okay, the word truth. He knows the truth. Not just that, the word emet is aleph, the first letter, taf, the last letter, and mem is the middle. Kind of a cool thing to know. But this golem listens to the Maharal, the rabbi of Prague, when there's attackers coming to attack the Jewish community. The rabbi tells him to wake up, and he goes out, scares the living daylights out of these attackers, and then comes back to the rabbi, and the rabbi tells him to sit down, and he goes back to sleep in the attic in the synagogue. So we do have some kind of a version of superheroes, but continuing in the story of those people who have showed us how to live a Jewish life and created the books and manuals of how to do that. So once again, we started with the Talmud. Oh, I guess we started with the Shulchan Aruch. here we go. The Talmud in around the 400s or 500s, Rashi and Rambam that write, that are included in the Talmud of today. The Rambam writes the Mishnah Torah, around the 1200s or so. And then we have the Shulchan Aruch and the tablecloth, the set table and the tablecloth by Rabbi Isserles and Joseph Caro. And moving forward, we now have modern day Judaism. And in modern day Judaism, we have this amazing invention called Zionism. And Zionism brings us to the land of Israel. Uh-oh, the technology is taking over. Okay, so we have some Zionist leaders, which we'll talk about very soon, and a couple of rabbis that I see as superheroes. One of them, and that, by the way, have affected and showed us in our modern world, the reform and conservative movements mostly, what does it mean to be Jewish in the modern world? So Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who really championed the idea of human rights, and the being Jewish is to fight for human rights. And he stood alongside Martin Luther King Jr. in the fight for the civil rights. And we have Rabbi Leo Beck, who was in the Holocaust and survived, and really put it as a sign, or something very important for him was the idea to resist. And by staying alive and not letting the oppressors put us down, that is one of the ways, or the main way, to be Jewish. And finally, in Zionism, we now have a very different way of understanding what it means to be Jewish. And I'm not sure if these guys are superheroes, but definitely heroes of mine. Theodor Herzl, the leader of the Zionist movement, and David Ben-Gurion. I always say that Theodor Herzl is the George Washington of Israel, sort of leading the charge of creating and rolling the ball forward of Zionism and the idea of a Jewish homeland. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Jewish people in Palestine and the first prime minister. And we really have different ways of looking at Judaism now because of these people. And I'll give an example. I just threw some words here like Zionism and socialism and kibbutz. And it's interesting, the way I think about this is how connected are you to the people of Israel, and how connected are you to the land of Israel? Because think about Jews 200 years ago or so. The land of Israel was some amorphous thing that they sort of knew about and thought about, but it wasn't something that was part of their Jewish identity. Today, Israel and the land of Israel is part of who we are as Jews, whether we live in Israel or if we live in Rhode Island. So the idea of the connection to the land is very different today than it was for other people. I put the word kibbutz here because, as Rachel told you in the beginning, I grew up on the kibbutz, and we had a very different way of being Jewish because I'll give you an example. On Friday night, we had a Shabbat dinner with about 500 people. Imagine cooking for 500 people. And the ceremonies and the things that we did were based on Judaism, but we lit candles and we said the blessing for the bread and the wine, but it wasn't the blessings that we say traditionally that you say on Shabbat in your homes. It was made up blessings that focused on our efforts of the week and about camaraderie and living together and all of our communal efforts in creating our home here in the land of Israel. And it's based on Zionists like a guy named Gordon, Abraham David Gordon, who basically said that the new Judaism is to be in the land of Israel and to work the land. Forget all what happens in the shtetl and all of that. Being in Israel, feeling the land, being a farmer like our ancestors were, that is the way to be Jewish. So for me, growing up, Judaism was very, very different. And finally, many of you might be thinking, where are the women in this list? There weren't many women in this list. And that's because the way our Judaism is created, and the people who actually study and write in Judaism. By the way, just as a side note, there's a whole a series of books called Rashi's Daughters. Rashi, remember the guy who simplified things in layman terms? Rashi's daughters apparently were studying Talmud and reading and very learned. But some of these women are heroes in my eyes, and I hope you'll join me in agreeing on that. Golda Meir, the first woman prime minister, originally from the Ukraine, from Kiev, moved to the United States as a teenager and eventually ended up in Israel, was the first woman prime minister of Israel in 1969, early 70s. She was an amazing leader. This woman is my personal hero. Her name is Anat Hoffman. She might have come to your synagogue to speak. She leads an organization called Women of the Wall, and she's definitely trying to change the perception and the understanding for Israelis about what does it mean to be Jewish and about what women are allowed and should be allowed to do, like blowing the shofar and wearing a talit and praying at the Western Wall and putting on tefillin and so on. I don't know who this is, but she definitely represents the young women of Israel of today that serve in the army and do everything that the men do better in most cases. And I figured since we do have an Israeli/Jewish representative in the Justice League for real, Gal Gadot, Wonder Woman, not exactly a superhero, but of course she's up there and could be added to the list. And finally, I'm glad you guys are still here, at least most of you. And I'm not going to answer these questions that are on your screen right now, but I think these are sort of interesting things to contemplate and to think about. One of the things that I like to do when I'm in Poland with groups, whether it's teenagers or adults, there's an area there in the Warsaw Ghetto that's called the Path of the Heroes. And I like to discuss with them before we even start to list all the heroes that were in there, is what does a hero mean? What is a hero to you? Who is a hero to you? Why are they considered a hero in our eyes or in your eyes? And maybe even for some of us, are we heroes to other people? And what kind of responsibility does that lead us and requires us to behave and do and so on. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed our presentation. And I'll stay on. As I said, I'll stop sharing my screen so we can see more of the people. And I'm happy to answer questions, or if you can see my email down there. Actually, that's my website, but Rachel can send you my email if you're interested. I'm happy to answer more questions or stay in touch. And as we say, hopefully next year we'll actually meet in Jerusalem, in Israel. So, okay, I'm going to stop sharing. And let's see if in the chat there was anything. Okay.
That was lovely, Gadi. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So grateful for you taking the time, especially considering it's almost midnight where you are. Does anyone have any questions for Gadi while we still have him?
I just want to say hello and send all my love to Amy and Gadi. He was our
Hi.
guide in Israel last year, and it was a magnificent trip. So thank you.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Sarah.
That's cool.
That's very cool.
I'll tell Amy you were on the call. You were on the Zoom call. That's great.
That's lovely.
I was about to say, if anyone has any intention of going to Israel after all of this, I can't recommend Gadi and Amy enough. We are part of a group of friends who are, they live in this world where there's a lot of past friends from NIFTY who love and cherish the land of Israel so much that they made it their profession. So we're just grateful that you made the time for us today. And I know there's already been conversation on my end for the religious school of how we can engage you and Amy in the future, because they are already doing so many wonderful things also geared for young people, which is great. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. Chag Sameach. Toda rabah.
תודה רבה.
Chag Sameach.
שמח,
Xag
and
Sameach.
thank you, everybody.
רבה.
לילה טוב.
Schlaf gut.
Live tov.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.